Section 4 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pamela Krantz. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 1, by John G. Nicolay and John Hay. Section 4, New Salem. During the latter part of the winter of the deep snow, Lincoln became acquainted with one Denton Offutt, an adventurous and discursive sort of merchant, with more irons in the fire than he could well manage. He wanted to take a flatboat and cargo to New Orleans, and having heard that Hanks and Lincoln had some experience of the river, he insisted on their joining him. John Johnston was afterwards added to the party, probably at the request of his foster brother, to share in the golden profits of the enterprise. For 50 cents a day and a contingent dividend of $20 apiece seemed like a promise of immediate opulence to the boys. In the spring, when the rivers broke up and the melting snow began to pour in torrents down every ravine and gully, the three young men paddled down the Sangamon in a canoe to the point where Jamestown now stands, whence they walked 5 miles to Springfield, where Offutt had given them rendezvous. They met him at Eliot's Tavern, and far from happy. Amid the multiplicity of his engagements he had failed to procure a flatboat, and the first work his new hands must do was to build one. They cut the timber with frontier innocence from Congress land, and soon had a serviceable craft afloat, with which they descended the current of the Sangamon to New Salem, a little village which seems to have been born for the occasion, as it came into existence just before the arrival of Lincoln, nourished for 7 years while he remained one of its citizens, and died soon after he went away. His introduction to his fellow citizens was effected in a peculiar and somewhat striking manner. Offutt's boat had come to serious embarrassment on Rutledge's mill dam, and the unwonted incident brought the entire population to the water's edge. They spent a good part of the day watching the hapless flatboat resting midships on the dam, the forward end in the air and the stern taking in the turbid Sangamon water. Nobody knew what to do with the disaster except the bow oar, who was described as a gigantic youth with his trousers rolled up some 5 feet, who was wading about the boat and rigging up some undescribed contrivance by which the cargo was unloaded, the boat tilted and the water let out by boring a hole through the bottom, and everything brought safely to moorings below the dam. This exploit gained for young Lincoln the enthusiastic admiration of his employer, and turned his own mind in the direction of an invention which he afterwards patented for lifting vessels over shoals. The model on which he obtained this patent, a little boat whittled by his own hand in 1849, after he had become prominent as a lawyer and politician, is still shown to visitors at the Department of the Interior. We have never learned that it has served any other purpose. They made a quick trip down the Sangamon, the Illinois, and the Mississippi rivers. Although it was but a repetition, in great part, of the trip young Lincoln had made with Gentry, it evidently created a far deeper impression on his mind than the former one. The simple and honest words of John Hanks leave no doubt of this. At New Orleans, he said, they saw for the first time negroes chained, maltreated, whipped, and scourged. Lincoln saw it, his heart bled, said nothing much, was silent, looked bad. I can say, knowing it, that it was on this trip that he formed his opinion of slavery. It run its iron in him then and there, May 1831. I have heard him say so often. The sight of men in chains was intolerable to him. 10 years after this he made another journey by water with his friend Joshua Speed of Kentucky. Writing to Speed about it after the lapse of 14 years, he says, "In 1841 you and I had together a tedious low water trip on a steamboat from Louisville to St. Louis. You may remember, as I well do, that from Louisville to the mouth of the Ohio there were on board 10 or a dozen slaves shackled together with irons. That sight was a continual torment to me, and I see something like it every time I touch the Ohio or any other slave border. It is not fair for you to assume that I have no interest in a thing which has and continually exercises the power of making me miserable. There have been several ingenious attempts to show the origin and occasion of Mr. Lincoln's anti-slavery convictions. They seem to us an idle waste of labor. These sentiments came with the first awakening of his mind and conscience, and were roused into active life and energy by the sight of fellow creatures in chains on an Ohio River steamboat and on the wharf at New Orleans. The party went up the river in the early summer and separated in St. Louis. Abraham walked in company with John Johnston from St. Louis to Coles County, and spent a few weeks there with his father, who had made another migration the year before. His final move was to Goose Nest Prairie, where he died in 1851. His grave, a mile and a half west of the town of Farmington, Illinois, is surmounted by an appropriate monument erected by his grandson, the Hon. Robert T. Lincoln. At the age of 73 years, after a life which, though not successful in any material or worldly point of view, was probably far happier than that of his illustrious son, being unvexed by enterprise or ambition, Abraham never lost sight of his parents. He continued to aid and befriend them in every way, even when he could ill afford it, and when his benefactions were imprudently used. He not only comforted their declining years with every aid his affection could suggest, but he did everything in his power to assist his stepbrother, Johnston, a hopeless task enough. The following rigidly truthful and yet kindly letters will show how mentor-like and masterful, as well as generous, were the relations that Mr. Lincoln held to these friends and companions of his childhood. Dear Johnston: Your request for $80 I do not think it best to comply with now. At the various times when I have helped you a little, you have said to me, "We can get along very well now," but in a very short time I find you in the same difficulty again. Now this can only happen by some defect in your conduct. What that defect is, I think I know. You are not lazy, and still you are an idler. I doubt whether, since I saw you, you have done a good whole day's work in any one day. You do not very much dislike to work, and still you do not work much, merely because it does not seem to you that you could get much for it. This habit of uselessly wasting time is the whole difficulty, and it is vastly important to you, and still more so to your children, that you should break the habit. It is more important to them because they have longer to live, and can keep out of an idle habit before they are in it easier than they can get out after they are in. You are now in need of some money, and what I propose is that you shall go to work tooth and nail for somebody who will give you money for it. Let father and your boys take charge of things at home, prepare for a crop and make the crop, and you go to work for the best money wages, or in discharge of any debt you owe that you can get. And to secure you a fair reward for your labor, I now promise you that for every $1 you will, between this and the 1st of next May, get for your own labor, either in money or as discharging your own indebtedness, I will then give you one other $1. By this, if you hire yourself at $10 a month, from me you will get 10 more, making $20 a month for your work. In this I do not mean you should go off to St. Louis, or the lead mines, or the gold mines in California, but I mean for you to go at it for the best wages you can get close to home, in Coles County. Now if you will do this, you will soon be out of debt, and, what is better, you will have a habit that will keep you from getting in debt again. But if I should now clear you out of debt, next year you would be just as deep in as ever. You say you would almost give your place in heaven for $70 or $80. Then you value your place in heaven very cheap, for I am sure you can, with the offer I make, get the $70 or $80 for 4 or 5 months' work. You say if I will furnish you the money, you will deed me the land, and if you don't pay the money back, you will deliver possession. Nonsense! If you can't now live with the land, how will you then live without it? You have always been kind to me, and I do not mean to be unkind to you. On the contrary, if you will but follow my advice, you will find it worth more than 80 times $80 to you. Here is a later epistle, still more graphic and terse in statement, which has the unusual merit of painting both confessor and penitent to the life. Shelbyville, November 4, 1851. Dear Brother, when I came into Charleston, day before yesterday, I learned that you were anxious to sell the land where you live and move to Missouri. I have been thinking of this ever since, and cannot but think such a notion is utterly foolish. What can you do in Missouri better than here? Is the land any richer? Can you there, any more than here, raise corn and wheat and oats without work? Will anybody there, any more than here, do your work for you? If you intend to go to work, there is no better place than right where you are. If you do not intend to go to work, you cannot get along anywhere. Squirming and crawling about from place to place can do no good. You have raised no crop this year, and what you really want is to sell the land, get the money, and spend it. Part with the land you have, and my life upon it, you will never after own a spot big enough to bury you in. Half you will get for the land you will spend in moving to Missouri, and the other half you will eat and drink and wear out, and no foot of land will be bought. Now, I feel it is my duty to have no hand in such a piece of foolery. I feel that it is so even on your own account, and particularly on Mother's account. The eastern 40 acres I intend to keep for Mother while she lives. If you will not cultivate it, it will rent for enough to support her. At least it will rent for something. Her dower in the other 2 40s she can let you have, and no thanks to me. Now do not misunderstand this letter. I do not write it in any unkindness. I write it in order, if possible, to get you to face the truth, which truth is, you are destitute because you have idled away all your time. Your 1,000 pretenses deceive nobody but yourself. Go to work is the only cure for your case. A volume of disquisition could not put more clearly before the reader the difference between Abraham Lincoln and the common run of Southern and Western rural laborers. He had the same disadvantages that they had. He grew up in the midst of poverty and ignorance. He was poisoned with the enervating malaria of the Western woods, as all his fellows were, and the consequences of it were seen in his character and conduct to the close of his life. But he had, what very few of them possessed any glimmering notion of, a fixed and inflexible will to succeed. He did not love work, probably any better than John Johnston, but he had an innate self-respect and a consciousness that his self was worthy of respect that kept him from idleness as it kept him from all other vices, and made him a better man every year that he lived. We have anticipated a score of years in speaking of Mr. Lincoln's relations to his family. It was in August of the year 1831 that he finally left his father's roof, and swung out for himself into the current of the world to make his fortune in his own way. He went down to New Salem again to assist Offutt in the business that lively speculator thought of establishing there. He was more punctual than either his employer or the merchandise, and met with the usual reward of punctuality in being forced to waste his time in waiting for the tardy ones. He seemed to the New Salem people to be loafing. Several of them have given that description of him. He did one day's work acting as clerk of a local election, a lettered loafer being pretty sure of employment on such an occasion. Footnote: Mrs. Lizzie H. Bell writes of this incident: "My father, Menton Graham, was on that day as usual appointed to be a clerk, and Mr. McNamee, who was to be the other, was sick and failed to come. They were looking around for a man to fill his place when my father noticed Mr. Lincoln, and asked if he could write.
he answered that he could make a few rabbit tracks. He also piloted a boat down the Sangamon for one Dr. Nelson, who had had enough of New Salem and wanted to go to Texas. This was probably a task not requiring much pilot craft, as the river was much swollen, and navigators had in most places 2 or 3 miles of channel to count upon. But Offutt and his goods arrived at last, and Lincoln and he got them immediately into position, and opened their doors to what commerce could be found in New Salem. There was clearly not enough to satisfy the volatile mind of Mr. Offutt, for he soon bought Cameron's mill at the historic dam, and made Abraham superintendent also of that branch of the business. It is to be surmised that Offutt never inspired his neighbors and customers with any deep regard for his solidity of character. One of them says of him, with injurious pleonasm, that he talked too much with his mouth. A natural consequence of his excessive fluency was soon to be made disagreeably evident to his clerk. He admired Abraham beyond measure, and praised him beyond prudence. He said that Abe knew more than any man in the United States, and he was certainly not warranted in making such an assertion, as his own knowledge of the actual state of science in America could not have been exhaustive. He also said that Abe could beat any man in the county running, jumping, or wrastling. This proposition, being less abstract in its nature, was more readily grasped by the local mind, and was not likely to pass unchallenged. Public opinion at New Salem was formed by a crowd of ruffianly young fellows who were called the Clary's Grove Boys. Once or twice a week they descended upon the village and passed the day in drinking, fighting, and brutal horseplay. If a stranger appeared in the place, he was likely to suffer a rude initiation into the social life of New Salem at the hands of these jovial savages. Sometimes he was nailed up in a hogshead and rolled down hill. Sometimes he was insulted into a fight and then mauled black and blue. For despite their pretensions to chivalry, they had no scruples about fair play or any such superstitions of civilization. At first they did not seem inclined to molest young Lincoln. His appearance did not invite insolence. His reputation for strength and activity was a greater protection to him than his inoffensive good nature. But the loud admiration of Offutt gave them umbrage. It led to dispute, contradictions, and finally to a formal banter, to a wrestling match. Lincoln was greatly averse to all this wooling and pulling, as he called it, but Offutt's indiscretion had made it necessary for him to show his mettle. Jack Armstrong, the leading bully of the gang, was selected to throw him, and expected an easy victory. But he soon found himself in different hands from any he had heretofore engaged with. Seeing he could not manage the tall stranger, his friends swarmed in, and by kicking and tripping nearly succeeded in getting Lincoln down. At this, as has been said of another hero, the spirit of Odin entered into him, and putting forth his whole strength, he held the pride of Clary's Grove in his arms like a child, and almost choked the exuberant life out of him. For a moment a general fight seemed inevitable, but Lincoln, standing undismayed with his back to the wall, looked so formidable in his defiance that an honest admiration took the place of momentary fury, and his initiation was over. As to Armstrong, he was Lincoln's friend and sworn brother as soon as he recovered the use of his larynx, and the bond thus strangely created lasted through life. Lincoln had no further occasion to fight his own battles, while Armstrong was there to act as his champion. The two friends, although so widely different, were helpful to each other afterwards in many ways, and Lincoln made ample amends for the liberty his hands had taken with Jack's throat, by saving, in a memorable trial, his son's neck from the halter. This incident, trivial and vulgar as it may seem, was of great importance in Lincoln's life. His behavior in this ignoble scuffle did the work of years for him, in giving him the position he required in the community where his lot was cast. He became from that moment, in a certain sense, a personage, with a name and standing of his own.
The verdict of Clary's Grove was unanimous that he was the cleverest fellow that had ever broke into the settlement. He did not have to be constantly scuffling to guard his self-respect, and at the same time he gained the goodwill of the better sort by his evident peaceableness and integrity. He made, on the whole, a satisfactory clerk for Mr. Offutt, though his downright honesty must have seemed occasionally as eccentric in that position as afterwards it did to his associates at the bar. Dr. Holland has preserved one or two incidents of this kind, which have their value. Once, after he had sold a woman a little bill of goods and received the money, he found on looking over the account again that she had given him 6 1/4 cents too much. The money burned in his hands until he locked the shop and started on a walk of several miles in the night to make restitution before he slept. On another occasion, after weighing and delivering a pound of tea, he found a small weight on the scales. He immediately weighed out the quantity of tea of which he had innocently defrauded his customer, and went in search of her, his sensitive conscience not permitting any delay. To show that the young merchant was not too good for this world, the same writer gives an incident of his shopkeeping experience of a different character. A rural bully having made himself especially offensive one day, when women were present, by loud profanity, Lincoln requested him to be silent. This was of course a cause of war, and the young clerk was forced to follow the incensed ruffian into the street, where the combat was of short duration. Lincoln threw him at once to the ground, and gathering a handful of the dog fennel with which the roadside was plentifully bordered, he rubbed the ruffian's face and eyes with it until he howled for mercy. He did not howl in vain, for the placable giant, when his discipline was finished, brought water to bathe the culprit's smarting face, and doubtless improved the occasion with quaint admonition. A few passages at arms of this sort gave Abraham a redoubtable reputation in the neighborhood. But the principal use he made of his strength and his prestige was in the capacity of peacemaker, an office which soon devolved upon him by general consent. Whenever old feuds blossomed into fights by Offutt's door, or the chivalry of Clary's Grove attempted in its energetic way to take the conceit out of some stranger, or a canine duel spread contagion of battle among the masters of the beasts, Lincoln usually appeared upon the scene, and with a judicious mixture of force and reason and invincible good nature restored peace. While working with Offutt his mind was turned in the direction of English grammar. From what he had heard of it he thought it a matter within his grasp, if he could once fall in with the requisite machinery. Consulting with Minton, [Footnote: This name has always been written in Illinois Minter, but a letter from Mr. Graham's daughter, Mrs. Bell, says that her father's name is as given in the text.] Graham, the schoolmaster, in regard to it, and learning the whereabouts of a vagrant, Kirkham's Grammar, he set off at once and soon returned from a walk of 12 miles with the coveted prize. He devoted himself to the new study with that peculiar intensity of application which always remained his most valuable faculty, and soon knew all that can be known about it from rules. He seemed surprised, as others have been, at the meager dimensions of the science he had acquired, and the ease with which it yielded all there was of it to the student. But it seemed no slight achievement to the New Salemites, and contributed not a little to the prevalent impression of his learning. His name is prominently connected with an event which just at this time caused an excitement and interest in Salem and the neighboring towns entirely out of proportion to its importance. It was one of the articles of faith of most of the settlers on the banks of the Sangamon River that it was a navigable stream, and the local politicians found that they could in no way more easily hit the fancy of their hearers than by discussing this assumed fact, and the logical corollary derived from it, that it was the duty of the State or the nation to clear out the snags and give free course to the commerce which was waiting for an opportunity to pour along this natural highway. At last one Captain Vincent Bogue of Springfield determined to show that the thing could be done by doing it. The first promise of the great enterprise appears in the Sangsmo Journal of January 26, 1832, in a letter from the captain, at Cincinnati, saying he would ascend the Sangamon by steam on the breaking up of the ice. He asked that he might be met at the mouth of the river by 10 or 12 men, having axes with long handles, to cut away the overhanging branches of the trees on the banks. From this moment there was great excitement, public meetings, appointment of committees, appeals for subscriptions, and a scattering fire of advertisements of goods and freight to be bargained for, which sustained the prevailing interest. It was a day of hope and promise when the advertisement reached Springfield from Cincinnati that the splendid upper cabin steamer Talisman would positively start for the Sangamon on a given day. As the paper containing this joyous intelligence also complained that no mail had reached Springfield from the East for 3 weeks, it is easy to understand the desire for more rapid and regular communications. From week to week the progress of the Talisman, impeded by bad weather and floating ice, was faithfully recorded, until at last the party with long-handled axes went down to Beardstown to welcome her. It is needless to state that Lincoln was one of the party. His standing as a scientific citizen of New Salem would have been enough to insure his selection, even if he had not been known as a bold navigator. He piloted the Talisman safely through the windings of the Sangamon, and Springfield gave itself up to extravagant gaiety on the event that proved she could no longer be considered an inland town. Captain Bogue announced fresh and seasonable goods just received per steamboat Talisman, and the local poets illuminated the columns of the journal with odes on her advent. The joy was short-lived. The Talisman met the natural fate of steamboats a few months later, being burned at the St. Louis wharf. Neither state nor nation has ever removed the snags from the Sangamon, and no subsequent navigator of its waters has been found to eclipse the fame of the earliest one. End of Section 4. Recording by Pamela Krantz. Section 5 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pamela Krantz. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 1, by John G. Nicolay and John Hay. Section 5. Lincoln in the Black Hawk War. [Sidenote: 1832.] A new period in the life of Lincoln begins with the summer of 1832. He then obtained his first public recognition, and entered upon the course of life which was to lead him to a position of prominence and great usefulness. The business of Offutt had gone to pieces, and his clerk was out of employment, when Governor Reynolds issued his call for volunteers to move the tribe of Black Hawk across the Mississippi. For several years the raids of the old Sac chieftain upon that portion of his patrimony which he had ceded to the United States had kept the settlers in the neighborhood of Rock Island in terror, and menaced the peace of the frontier. In the spring of 1831 he came over to the east side of the river with a considerable band of warriors, having been encouraged by secret promises of cooperation from several other tribes. These failed him, however, when the time of trial arrived, and an improvised force of State volunteers, assisted by General E.P. Gaines and his detachment, had little difficulty in compelling the Indians to recross the Mississippi and to enter into a solemn treaty on the 30th of June, by which the former treaties were ratified, and Black Hawk and his leading warriors bound themselves never again to set foot on the east side of the river, without express permission from the President or the Governor of Illinois. [Sidenote: Reynolds' Life and Times, page 325. [Sidenote: History of Illinois, page 110.] But Black Hawk was too old a savage to learn respect for treaties or resignation under fancied wrongs. He was already at a term of life, chief of his nation for more than 40 years. He had scalped his first enemy when scarcely more than a child, having painted on his blanket the blood-red hand which marked his nobility at 15 years of age. Peace under any circumstances would doubtless have been irksome to him, but a peace which forbade him free access to his own hunting grounds and to the graves of his fathers was more than he could now school himself to endure. He had come to believe that he had been foully wronged by the treaty which was his own act. He had even convinced himself that land cannot be sold, a proposition in political economy which our modern socialists would be puzzled to accept or confute. Besides this, the tenderest feelings of his heart were outraged by this exclusion from his former domain. He had never passed a year since the death of his daughter without making a pilgrimage to her grave at Oquawka, and spending hours in mystic ceremonies and contemplation. He was himself prophet as well as warrior, and had doubtless his share of mania, which is the strength of prophets. The promptings of his own broken heart readily seemed to him the whisperings of attendant spirits, and day by day these unseen incitements increased around him, until they could not be resisted even if death stood in the way. He made his combinations during the winter, and had it not been for the loyal attitude of Keokuk, he could have brought the entire nation of the Sacs and Foxes to the war-path. As it was, the flower of the young men came with him, when, with the opening spring, he crossed the river once more. He came this time, he said, to plant corn, but as a preliminary to this peaceful occupation of the land he marched up the Rock River, expecting to be joined by the Winnebagoes and Pottawatomies. But the time was past for honorable alliances among the Indians. His oath-bound confederates gave him little assistance, and soon cast in their lot with the stronger party. This movement excited general alarm in the state. General Henry Atkinson, commanding the United States troops, sent a formal summons to Black Hawk to return, but the old chief was already well on his way to the lodge of his friend, the prophet Wabakishik, at Prophetstown, and treated the summons with contemptuous defiance. The governor immediately called for volunteers, and was himself astonished at the alacrity with which the call was answered. Among those who enlisted at the first tap of the drum was Abraham Lincoln, and equally to his surprise and delight he was elected captain of his company. The volunteer organizations of those days were conducted on purely democratic principles. The company assembled on the green, an election was suggested, and 3/4 of the men walked over to where Lincoln was standing. Most of the small remainder joined themselves to one Kirkpatrick, a man of some substance and standing from Spring Creek. We have the word of Mr. Lincoln for it that no subsequent success ever gave him such unmixed pleasure as this earliest distinction. It was a sincere, unsought tribute of his equals to those physical and moral qualities which made him the best man of his 100, and as such was accepted and prized. [Sidenote: Reynolds' Life and Times, page 363.] At the Beardstown rendezvous, Captain Lincoln's company was attached to Colonel Samuel Thompson's regiment, the 4th Illinois, which was organized at Richland, Sangamon County, on the 21st of April, and moved on the 27th, with the rest of the command under General Samuel Whitesides, for Yellow Banks, where the boats with provisions had been ordered to meet them. It was arduous marching. There were no roads and no bridges, and the day's task included a great deal of labor. The third day out they came to the Henderson River, a stream some 50 yards wide, swift and swollen with the spring thaws, with high and steep banks. To most armies this would have seemed a serious obstacle, but these backwoodsmen swarmed to the work like beavers, and in less than 3 hours the river was crossed with the loss of only 1 or 2 horses and wagons. When they came to Yellow Banks, on the Mississippi, the provision boats had not arrived, and for 3 days they waited there literally without food. Very uncomfortable days for Governor Reynolds, who accompanied the expedition, and was forced to hear the outspoken comments of 2,000 hungry men on his supposed inefficiency. But the 6th of May the William Wallace arrived, and this sight, says the governor with characteristic sincerity, was, I presume, the most interesting I ever beheld. From there they marched to the mouth of Rock River, and thence General Whitesides proceeded with his volunteers up the river some 90 miles to Dixon, where they halted to await the arrival of General Atkinson with the regular troops and provisions. There they found 2 battalions of fresh horsemen under Majors Stillman and Bailey, who had as yet seen no service and were eager for the fray. Whiteside's men were tired with their forced march, and besides, in their ardor to get forward, they had thrown away a good part of their provisions and left their baggage behind. It pleased the governor, therefore, to listen to the prayers of Stillman's braves, and he gave them orders to proceed to the head of Old Man's Creek, where it was supposed there were some hostile Indians, and coerce them into submission. "I thought," says the governor in his memoirs, "they might discover the enemy." The supposition was certainly well founded. They rode merrily away, came to Old Man's Creek, thereafter to be called Stillman's Run, and encamped for the night. By the failing light a small party of Indians was discovered on the summit of a hill a mile away, and a few courageous gentlemen hurriedly saddled their horses, and without orders rode after them. The Indians retreated, but were soon overtaken, and 2 or 3 of them killed. The volunteers were now strung along a half mile of hill and valley, with no more order or care than if they had been chasing rabbits. Black Hawk, who had been at supper when the running fight began, hastily gathered a handful of warriors and attacked the scattered whites. The onset of the savages acted like an icy bath on the red-hot valor of the volunteers. They turned and ran for their lives, stampeding the camp as they fled. There was very little resistance, so little that Black Hawk, fearing a ruse, tried to recall his warriors from the pursuit, but in the darkness and confusion could not enforce his orders. The Indians killed all they caught up with, but the volunteers had the fleeter horses, and only 11 were overtaken. The rest reached Dixon by 2s and 3s, rested all night, and took courage. General Whitesides marched out to the scene of the disaster the next morning, but the Indians were gone. They had broken up into small parties, and for several days they reaped the bloody fruit of their victory in the massacre of peaceful settlements in the adjacent districts. The time of enlistment of the volunteers had now come to an end, and the men, seeing no prospect of glory or profit, and weary of the work and the hunger which were the only certain incidents of the campaign, refused in great part to continue in service. But it is hardly necessary to say that Captain Lincoln was not one of these homesick soldiers. Not even the trammels of rank, which are usually so strong among the trailers of the saber, could restrain him from what he considered his simple duty. As soon as he was mustered out of his captaincy, he re-enlisted on the same day, May 27, as a private soldier. Several other officers did the same, among them General Whitesides and Major John T. Stuart. Lincoln became a member of Captain Elijah Iles's company of mounted volunteers, sometimes called the Independent Spy Battalion, an organization unique of its kind, if we may judge from the account given by one of its troopers. It was not, says Mr. George M. Harrison, under the control of any regiment or brigade, but received orders directly from the commander-in-chief, and always, when with the army, camped within the lines, and had many other privileges, such as having no camp duties to perform, and drawing rations as much and as often as we pleased, which would seem to liken this battalion as nearly as possible to the fabled regiment of brigadiers. With this elite corps, Lincoln served through his second enlistment, though it was not his fortune to take part in either of the 2 engagements in which General James D. Henry, at the Wisconsin Bluffs and the Bad Axe, broke and destroyed forever the power of Black Hawk and the British band of Sacs and Foxes. After Lincoln was relieved of the weight of dignity involved in his captaincy, the war became a sort of holiday, and the tall private from New Salem enjoyed it as much as any one. He entered with great zest into the athletic sports with which soldiers love to beguile the tedium of camp. He was admitted to be the strongest man in the army, and with one exception, the best wrestler. Indeed, his friends never admitted the exception, and severely blamed Lincoln for confessing himself defeated on the occasion when he met the redoubtable Thompson, and the two fell together on the turf. His popularity increased from the beginning to the end of the campaign, and those of his comrades who still survive always speak with hearty and affectionate praise of his character and conduct in those rough yet pleasantly remembered days. [Sidenote: Manuscript letters from Thomas, Gregg, and others.] The spy battalion formed no part of General Henry's forces when, by a disobedience of orders as prudent as it was audacious, he started with his slender force on the fresh trail which he was sure would lead him to Black Hawk's camp. He found and struck the enemy at bay on the bluffs of the Wisconsin River on the 21st of July, and inflicted upon them a signal defeat. The broken remnant of Black Hawk's power then fled for the Mississippi River, the whole army following in close pursuit, General Atkinson in front and General Henry bringing up the rear. Fortune favored the latter once more, for while Black Hawk with a handful of men was engaging and drawing away the force under Atkinson, General Henry struck the main trail and brought on the battle of the Bad Axe, if that could be called a battle, which was an easy slaughter of the weary and discouraged savages fighting without heart or hope, an army in front and the great river behind. Black Hawk escaped the fate of his followers, to be captured a few days later through the treachery of his allies. He was carried in triumph to Washington and presented to President Jackson, to whom he made this stern and defiant speech, showing how little age or disaster could do to tame his indomitable spirit. "I am a man and you are another. I did not expect to conquer the white people. I took up the hatchet to avenge injuries which could no longer be borne." [Footnote: It is a noteworthy coincidence that President Lincoln's proclamation at the opening of the war calls for troops to redress wrongs already long enough endured. End footnote. "Had I borne them longer, my people would have said, 'Black Hawk is a squaw. He is too old to be a chief. He is no Sac.' This caused me to raise the war whoop. I say no more of it. All is known to you." He returned to Iowa and died on the 3rd of October, 1838, at his camp on the River Des Moines. He was buried in gala dress, with cocked hat and sword, and the medals presented him by 2 governments. He was not allowed to rest even in his grave. His bones were exhumed by some greedy wretch and sold from hand to hand till they came at last to the Burlington Museum, where they were destroyed by fire. It was on the 16th of June, a month before the slaughter of the Bad Axe, that the battalion to which Lincoln belonged was at last mustered out at Whitewater, Wisconsin. His final release from the service was signed by a young lieutenant of artillery, Robert Anderson, who 29 years later, in one of the most awful crises in our annals, was to sustain to Lincoln relations of prodigious importance on a scene illuminated by the flash of the opening guns of the Civil War. [Footnote: A story to the effect that Lincoln was mustered into service by Jefferson Davis has for a long time been current, but the strictest search in the records fails to confirm it. We are indebted to General R.C. Drum, Adjutant General of the Army, for an interesting letter giving all the known facts in relation to this story. General Drum says: "The company of the 4th Regiment Illinois Mounted Volunteers, commanded by Mr. Lincoln, was, with others, called out by General Reynolds, and was organized at Richland, Sangamon County, Illinois, April 21, 1832. The muster-in roll is not on file, but the records show that the company was mustered out at the mouth of Fox River, May 27, 1832, by Nathaniel Buckmaster, brigade major to General Samuel Whiteside's Illinois Volunteers. On the muster roll of Captain Elijah Iles' company, Illinois Mounted Volunteers, A. Lincoln, Sangamon County, appears as a private from May 27, 1832, to June 16, 1832, when the company was mustered out of service by Lieutenant Robert Anderson, 3rd United States Artillery, and Colonel, Assistant Inspector General, Illinois Volunteers. Brigadier General Henry Atkinson, in his report of May 30, 1832, stated that the Illinois Volunteers were called out by the governor of that State, but in haste and for no definite period of service. On their arrival at Ottawa they became clamorous for their discharge, which the governor granted, retaining, of those who were discharged and volunteered for a further period of 20 days, a sufficient number of men to form 6 companies, which General Atkinson found at Ottawa on his arrival there from Rock River. General Atkinson further reports that these companies and some 300 regular troops remaining in position at Rock River were all the force left him to keep the enemy in check until the assemblage of the 3,000 additional Illinois militia called out by the governor upon his, General A's, requisition to rendezvous at Ottawa, June 12 through 15, 1832. There can be no doubt that Captain Iles's company mentioned above was one of the 6 which served until June 16, 1832, while the fact is fully established that the company of which Mr. Lincoln was a member was mustered out by Lieutenant Robert Anderson, who, in April, 1861, was in command of Fort Sumter. There is no evidence to show that it was mustered in by Lieutenant Jefferson Davis. Mr. Davis's company, B, 1st United States Infantry, was stationed at Fort Crawford, Wisconsin, during the months of January and February, 1832, and he is borne on the rolls as absent on detached service at the Dubuque mines by order of Colonel Morgan. From March 26 to August 18, 1832, the muster rolls of his company report him as absent on furlough. The men started home the next day in high spirits, schoolboys for their holidays. Lincoln had need, like Horatio, of his good spirits, for they were his only outfit for the long journey to New Salem. He and his messmate, Harrison, George M. Harrison, who gives an account of his personal experiences in Le Mans, page 116, having had their horses stolen the day before by some patriot over anxious to reach home. But as Harrison says, I laughed at our fate and he joked at it, and we all started off merrily. The generous men of our company walked and rode by turns with us, and we fared about equal with the rest. But for this generosity our legs would have had to do the better work, for in that day this dreary route furnished no horses to buy or to steal, and whether on horse or afoot we always had company, for many of the horses' backs were too sore for riding. It is not hard to imagine with what quips and quirks of native fancy Lincoln and his friends beguiled the way through forest and prairie. With youth, good health, and a clear conscience, and even then the dawn of a young and undefiled ambition in his heart, nothing was wanting to give zest and spice to this long, sociable walk of 100 leagues. One joke is preserved, and this one is at the expense of Lincoln. One chilly morning he complained of being cold. "No wonder," said some facetious cavalier, "there is so much of you on the ground." Dr. Holland gives this homely joke (Life of Lincoln, page 71), but transfers it to a time 4 years later, when Lincoln had permanently assumed shoes and had a horse of his own. We hope Lincoln's contributions to the fun were better than this, but of course the prosperity of these jests lay rather in the liberal ears that heard them than in the good-natured tongues that uttered them. Lincoln and Harrison could not have been altogether penniless, for at Peoria they bought a canoe and paddled down to Pekin. Here the ingenious Lincoln employed his hereditary talent for carpentry by making an oar for the frail vessel, while Harrison was providing the commissary stores. The latter goes on to say, "The river being very low was without current, so that we had to pull hard to make half the speed of legs on land. In fact, we let her float all night, and on the next morning always found the objects still visible that were beside us the previous evening." The water was remarkably clear for this river of plants, and the fish appeared to be sporting with us as we moved over or near them. On the next day after we left Pekin we overhauled a raft of saw logs, with 2 men afloat on it to urge it on with poles and to guide it in the channel. We immediately pulled up to them and went on the raft, where we were made welcome by various demonstrations, especially by an invitation to a feast on fish, cornbread, eggs, butter, and coffee, just prepared for our benefit. Of these good things we ate almost immoderately, for it was the only warm meal we had made for several days. While preparing it and after dinner, Lincoln entertained them, and they entertained us for a couple of hours very amusingly. Kindly human companionship was a luxury in that green wilderness, and was readily appreciated and paid for. The returning warriors dropped down the river to the village of Havana, from Pekin to Havana in a canoe! The country is full of these geographical nightmares, the necessary result of freedom of nomenclature bestowed by circumstances upon minds equally destitute of taste or education. There they sold their boat, no difficult task, for a canoe was a staple article in any river town, and again set out the old way over the sand ridges for Petersburg. As we drew near home the impulse became stronger and urged us on amazingly. The long strides of Lincoln, often slipping back in the loose sand 6 inches every step, were just right for me, and he was greatly diverted when he noticed me behind him, stepping along in his tracks to keep from slipping. Thus the two comrades came back from their soldierings to their humble homes, from which Lincoln was soon to start on the way marked out for him by Providence, with strides which no comrade, with whatever good will, might hope to follow. He never took his campaigning seriously. The politician's habit of glorifying the petty incidents of a candidate's life always seemed absurd to him, and in his speech, made in 1848, ridiculing the effort on the part of General Cass's friends to draw some political advantage from that gentleman's respectable but obscure services on the frontier in the war with Great Britain, he stopped any future eulogist from painting his own military achievements in too lively colors. "Did you know, Mr. Speaker," he said, "I am a military hero. In the days of the Black Hawk War I fought, bled, and came away. I was not at Stillman's defeat, but I was about as near it as General Cass was to Hull's surrender, and like him I saw the place very soon afterwards. It is quite certain I did not break my sword, for I had none to break, but I bent my musket pretty badly on one occasion. If General Cass went in advance of me picking whortleberries, I guess I surpassed him in charges on the wild onions. If he saw any live fighting Indians, it was more than I did, but I had a good many bloody struggles with the mosquitoes, and although I never fainted from loss of blood, I can truly say I was often very hungry. If ever I should conclude to doff whatever our Democratic friends may suppose there is of black cockade Federalism about me, and thereupon they shall take me up as their candidate for the presidency, I protest that they shall not make fun of me, as they have of General Cass, by attempting to write me into a military hero." Section 6
of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephen L. Moss. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 1, by John G. Nicolay and John Hay. Section 6. Surveyor and Representative. The discharged volunteer arrived in New Salem only 10 days before the August election, in which he had a deep personal interest. Before starting for the wars he had announced himself, according to the custom of the time, by a handbill circular, as a candidate for the legislature from Sangamon County. Footnote: we are aware that all former biographers have stated that Lincoln's candidacy for the legislature was subsequent to his return from the war, and a consequence of his service, but his circular is dated March 9, 1832, and the Sangamo Journal mentions his name among the candidates in July, and apologizes for having accidentally omitted it in May. End footnote. He had done this in accordance with his own natural bent for public life and desire for usefulness and distinction, and not without strong encouragement from friends whose opinion he valued. He had even then considerable experience in speaking and thinking on his feet. He had begun his practice in that direction before leaving Indiana, and continued it everywhere he had gone. Mr. William Butler tells us that on one occasion, when Lincoln was a farmhand at Island Grove, the famous circuit rider, Peter Cartwright, came by, electioneering for the legislature, and Lincoln at once engaged in a discussion with him in the cornfield, in which the great Methodist was equally astonished at the close reasoning and the uncouth figure of Mr. Brown's extraordinary hired man. At another time, after one Posey, a politician in search of office, had made a speech in Macon, John Hanks, whose admiration of his cousin's oratory was unbounded, said that Abe could beat it. He turned a keg on end, and the tall boy mounted it and made his speech. The subject was the navigation of the Sangamon, and Abe beat him to death, says the loyal Hanks. So it was not without the tremor of a complete novice that the young man took the stump during the few days left him between his return and the election. He ran as a Whig. As this has been denied on authority which is generally trustworthy, it is well enough to insist upon the fact. We have a memorandum in Mr. Lincoln's own handwriting in which he says he ran as an avowed Clay man. In one of the few speeches of his, which made at this time have been remembered and reported, he said, "I am in favor of a national bank. I am in favor of the internal improvement system and of a high protective tariff. These are my sentiments and political principles." Nothing could be more unqualified or outspoken than this announcement of his adhesion to what was then and for years afterwards called the American system of Henry Clay. Other testimony is not wanting to the same effect. Both Major Stuart and Judge Logan, (Footnote: The Democrats of New Salem worked for Lincoln out of their personal regard for him. That was the general understanding of the matter here at the time. In this he made no concession of principle whatever. He was as stiff as a man could be in his Whig doctrines. They did this for him simply because he was popular, because he was Lincoln. Stephen T. Logan, July 6, 1875. Say that Lincoln ran in 1832 as a Whig, and that his speeches were unevasively in defense of the principles of that party. Without discussing the merits of the party or its purposes, we may insist that his adopting them thus openly at the outset of his career was an extremely characteristic act, and marks thus early the scrupulous conscientiousness which shaped every action of his life. The state of Illinois was by a large majority Democratic, hopelessly attached to the person and policy of Jackson. Nowhere had that despotic leader more violent and unscrupulous partisans than there. They were proud of their very servility, and preferred the name of whole hog Jackson men to that of Democrats. The Whigs embraced in their scanty ranks the leading men of the state, those who have since been most distinguished in its history, such as S.T. Logan, Stuart, Browning, Dubois, Hardin, Breese, and many others. But they were utterly unable to do anything except by dividing the Jackson men, whose very numbers made their party unwieldy, and by throwing their votes with the more decent and conservative portion of them. In this way, in the late election, they had secured the success of Governor Reynolds, the old Ranger, against Governor Kinney, who represented the vehement and proscriptive spirit which Jackson had just breathed into the party. He had visited the general in Washington, and had come back giving out threatenings and slaughter against the Whigs in the true Tennessee style, declaring that all Whigs should be whipped out of office like dogs out of a meat-house. The force of southwestern simile could no further go. But the great popularity of Reynolds and the adroit management of the Whigs carried him through successfully. A single fact will show on which side the people who could read were enlisted. The whole hog party had one newspaper, the opposition 5. Of course it would have been impossible for Reynolds to poll a respectable vote if his loyalty to Jackson had been seriously doubted. As it was, he lost many votes through a report that he had been guilty of saying that he was as strong for Jackson as any reasonable man should be. The governor himself, in his naive account of the canvass, acknowledges the damaging nature of this accusation, and comforts himself with quoting an indiscretion of Kinney's, who opposed a projected canal on the ground that it would flood the country with Yankees. It showed some moral courage, and certainly an absence of the shuffling politician's fair-weather policy, that Lincoln, in his obscure and penniless youth, at the very beginning of his career, when he was not embarrassed by antecedents or family connections, and when, in fact, what little social influence he knew would have led him the other way, chose to oppose a furiously intolerant majority, and to take his stand with the party which was doomed to long-continued defeat in Illinois. The motives which led him to take this decisive course are not difficult to imagine. The better sort of people in Sangamon County were Whigs, though the majority were Democrats, and he preferred through life the better sort to the majority. The papers he read were the Louisville Journal and the Sangamo Journal, both Whig. Reading the speeches and debates of the day, he sided with Webster against Calhoun, and with Clay against anybody. Though his notions of politics, like those of any ill-educated young man of 22, must have been rather crude, and not at all sufficient to live and to die by, he had adopted them honestly and sincerely, with no selfish regard to his own interests, and though he ardently desired success, he never abated one jot or tittle of his convictions for any possible personal gain, then or thereafter. In the circular in which he announced his candidacy he made no reference to national politics, but confined himself mainly to a discussion of the practicability of improving the navigation of the Sangamon, the favorite hobby of the place and time. He had no monopoly of this issue. It formed the burden of nearly every candidate's appeal to the people in that year. The excitement occasioned by the trip of the Talisman had not yet died away, although the little steamer was now dust and ashes, and her bold commander had left the state to avoid an awkward meeting with the sheriff. The hope of seeing Springfield an emporium of commerce was still lively among the citizens of Sangamon County, and in no one of the handbills of the political aspirants of the season was that hope more judiciously encouraged than in the one signed by Abraham Lincoln. It was a well-written circular, remarkable for its soberness and reserve when we consider the age and the limited advantages of the writer. It concluded in these words: "Upon the subjects of which I have treated, I have spoken as I have thought. I may be wrong in regard to any or all of them, but holding it a sound maxim that it is better only sometimes to be right than at all times wrong, so soon as I discover my opinions to be erroneous I shall be ready to renounce them. Every man is said to have his peculiar ambition. Whether it be true or not, I can say for one, that I have no other so great as that of being truly esteemed by my fellow men, by rendering myself worthy of their esteem. How far I shall succeed in gratifying this ambition is yet to be developed. I am young, and unknown to many of you. I was born and have ever remained in the most humble walks of life. I have no wealthy or powerful relations or friends to recommend me. My case is thrown exclusively upon the independent voters of the county, and if elected, they will have conferred a favor upon me for which I shall be unremitting in my labors to compensate. But if the good people in their wisdom shall see fit to keep me in the background, I have been too familiar with disappointments to be very much chagrined." This is almost precisely the style of his later years. The errors of grammar and construction which spring invariably from an effort to avoid redundancy of expression remained with him through life. He seemed to grudge the space required for necessary parts of speech. But his language was at 22, as it was 30 years later, the simple and manly attire of his thought, with little attempt at ornament and none at disguise. There was an intermediate time when he sinned in the direction of fine writing. But this ebullition soon passed away, and left that marvelously strong and transparent style in which his two inaugurals were written. Of course, in the 10 days left him after his return from the field, a canvass of the county, which was then, before its division, several thousand square miles in extent, was out of the question. He made a few speeches in the neighborhood of New Salem, and at least one in Springfield. He was wholly unknown there except by his few comrades in arms. We find him mentioned in the county paper only once during the summer, in an editorial note adding the name of Captain Lincoln to those candidates for the legislature who were periling their lives on the frontier and had left their reputations in charge of their generous fellow citizens at home. On the occasion of his speaking at Springfield, most of the candidates had come together to address a meeting there to give their electors some idea of their quality. These were severe ordeals for the rash aspirants for popular favor. Besides those citizens who came to listen and judge, there were many whose only object was the free whiskey provided for the occasion, and who, after potations pottle deep, became not only highly unparliamentary, but even dangerous to life and limb. This wild chivalry of Lick Creek was, however, less redoubtable to Lincoln than it might be to an urban statesman unacquainted with the frolic brutality of Clary's Grove. Their gambols never caused him to lose his self-possession. It is related that once, while he was speaking, he saw a ruffian attack a friend of his in the crowd, and the rencontre not resulting according to the orator's sympathies, he descended from the stand, seized the objectionable fighting man by the neck, threw him some 10 feet, then calmly mounted to his place and finished his speech, the course of his logic undisturbed by this athletic parenthesis. Judge Logan saw Lincoln for the first time on the day when he came up to Springfield on his canvass this summer. He thus speaks of his future partner. He was a very tall, gawky, and rough-looking fellow then. His pantaloons didn't meet his shoes by 6 inches. But after he began speaking I became very much interested in him. He made a very sensible speech. His manner was very much the same as in after life. That is, the same peculiar characteristics were apparent then, though of course in after years he evinced more knowledge and experience. But he had then the same novelty and the same peculiarity in presenting his ideas. He had the same individuality that he kept through all his life. There were 2 or 3 men at the meeting whose good opinion was worth more than all the votes of Lick Creek to one beginning life. Stephen T. Logan, a young lawyer who had recently come from Kentucky with the best equipment for a Nisi Prius practitioner ever brought into the state. Major Stewart, whom we have met in the Black Hawk War, once commanding a battalion and then marching as a private, and William Butler, afterwards prominent in state politics, at that time a young man of the purest Western breed in body and character, clear-headed and courageous, and ready for any emergency where a friend was to be defended or an enemy punished. We do not know whether Lincoln gained any votes that day, but he gained what was far more valuable, the active friendship of these able and honorable men, all Whigs, and all Kentuckians like himself. The acquaintances he made in his canvass, the practice he gained in speaking, and the added confidence which this experience of measuring his abilities with those of others gave, were all the advantages which Lincoln derived from this attempt. He was defeated, for the only time in his life, in a contest before the people. The fortunate candidates were E. D. Taylor, J. T. Stewart, Achilles Morris, and Peter Cartwright, the first of whom received 1,127 votes, and the last 815. Lincoln's position among the 8 defeated candidates was a very respectable one. He had 657 votes, and there were 5 who fared worse, among them his old adversary Kirkpatrick. What must have been especially gratifying to him was the fact that he received the almost unanimous vote of his own neighborhood, the precinct of New Salem, 277 votes against 3, a result which showed more strongly than any words could do the extent of the attachment and the confidence which his genial and upright character had inspired among those who knew him best. Having been, even in so slight a degree, a soldier and a politician, he was unfitted for a day laborer, but being entirely without means of subsistence, he was forced to look about for some suitable occupation. We know he thought seriously at this time of learning the trade of a blacksmith, and using in that honest way the sinew and brawn which nature had given him. But an opening for another kind of business occurred, which prevented his entering upon any merely mechanical occupation. Two of his most intimate friends were the brothers Herndon, called according to the fashion of the time, which held it unfriendly to give a man his proper name, and arrogant for him to claim it, Roe and Jim. They kept one of those grocery stores in which everything saleable on the frontier was sold, and which seemed to have changed their occupants as rapidly as sentry boxes. Jim sold his share to an idle and dissolute man named Berry, and Roe soon transferred his interest to Lincoln. It was easy enough to buy, as nothing was ever given in payment but a promissory note. A short time afterwards, one Reuben Radford, who kept another shop of the same kind, happened one evening to attract the dangerous attention of the Clary's Grove boys, who, with their usual prompt and practical facetiousness, without a touch of malice in it, broke his windows and wrecked his store. The next morning, while Radford was ruefully contemplating the ruin, and doubtless concluding that he had had enough of a country where the local idea of neighborly humor found such eccentric expression, he hailed a passer-by named Green, and challenged him to buy his establishment for $400. This sort of trade was always irresistible to these Western speculators, and Green at once gave his note for the amount. It next occurred to him to try to find out what the property was worth, and doubting his own skill, he engaged Lincoln to make an invoice of it. The young merchant, whose appetite for speculation had just been whetted by his own investment, undertook the task, and finding the stock of goods rather tempting, offered Green $250 for his bargain, which was at once accepted. Not a cent of money changed hands in all these transactions. By virtue of half a dozen signatures, Berry and Lincoln became proprietors of the only mercantile establishment in the village, and the apparent wealth of the community was increased by a liberal distribution of their notes among the Herndons, Radford, Green, and a Mr. Rutledge, whose business they had also bought. Fortunately for Lincoln and for the world, the enterprise was not successful. It was entered into without sufficient reflection, and from the very nature of things was destined to fail. To Berry, the business was merely the refuge of idleness. He spent his time in gossip, and drank up his share of the profits, and it is probable that Lincoln was far more interested in politics and general reading than in the petty traffic of his shop. In the spring of the next year, finding that their merchandise was gaining them little or nothing, they concluded to keep a tavern in addition to their other business, and the records of the county court of Sangamon County show that Berry took out a license for that purpose on the 6th of March, 1833. Footnote: the following is an extract from the court record. March 6, 1833. Ordered that William F. Berry, in the name of Berry and Lincoln, have license to keep a tavern in New Salem, to continue 12 months from this date, and that they pay $1 in addition to $6 heretofore prepaid as per treasurer's receipt, and that they be allowed the following rates, viz. French brandy per pint 25, peach 183/4, apple 12, Holland gin 183/4, domestic 121/2, wine 25, rum 183/4, whiskey 121/2, breakfast, dinner, or supper 25, lodging for night 121/2, horse for night 25, single feed 121/2, breakfast, dinner, or supper for stage passengers 371/2. Who gave bond as required by law But it was even then too late for any expedients to save the moribund partnership. The tavern was never opened, for about this time Lincoln and Berry were challenged to sell out to a pair of vagrant brothers named Trent, who, as they had no idea of paying, were willing to give their notes to any amount. They soon ran away, and Berry expired, extinguished in rum. Lincoln was thus left loaded with debts, and with no assets except worthless notes of Berry and the Trents. It is greatly to his credit that he never thought of doing by others as others had done by him. The morality of the frontier was deplorably loose in such matters, and most of these people would have concluded that the failure of the business expunged its liabilities. But Lincoln made no effort even to compromise the claims against him. He promised to pay when he could, and it took the labor of years to do it, but he paid at last every farthing of the debt, which seemed to him and his friends so large that it was called among them the national debt. He had already begun to read elementary books of law, borrowed from Major Stuart and other kindly acquaintances. Indeed, it is quite possible that Berry and Lincoln might have succeeded better in business if the junior member of the firm had not spent so much of his time reading Blackstone and Chitty in the shade of a great oak just outside the door, while the senior quietly fuddled himself within. Eye-witnesses still speak of the grotesque youth, habited in homespun tow, lying on his back with his feet on the trunk of the tree, and poring over his book by the hour, grinding around with the shade, as it shifted from north to east. After his store, to use his own expression, had winked out, he applied himself with more continuous energy to his reading, doing merely what odd jobs came to his hand to pay his current expenses, which were of course very slight. He sometimes helped his friend Ellis in his store, sometimes went into the field and renewed his exploits as a farm hand, which had gained him a traditional fame in Indiana, sometimes employed his clerky hand in straightening up a neglected ledger. It is probable that he worked for his board oftener than for any other compensation, and his hearty friendliness and vivacity, as well as his industry in the field, made him a welcome guest in any farmhouse in the county. His strong arm was always at the disposal of the poor and needy. It is said of him, with a graphic variation of a well-known text, that he visited the fatherless and the widow and chopped their wood. In the spring of this year, 1833, he was appointed postmaster of New Salem, and held the office for 3 years. Its emoluments were slender, and its duties light, but there was in all probability no citizen of the village who could have made so much of it as he. The mails were so scanty that he was said to carry them in his hat, and he is also reported to have read every newspaper that arrived. It is altogether likely that this formed the leading inducement of his taking the office. His incumbency lasted until New Salem ceased to be populous enough for a post station, and the mail went by to Petersburg. Dr. J.G. Holland relates a sequel to this official experience, which illustrates the quaint honesty of the man. Several years later, when he was a practicing lawyer, an agent of the Post Office Department called upon him and asked for a balance due from the New Salem office, some $17. Lincoln rose, and opening a little trunk which lay in a corner of the room, took it from a cotton rag in which was tied up the exact sum required. "I never use any man's money but my own," he quietly remarked. When we consider the pinching poverty in which these years had been passed, we may appreciate the self-denial which had kept him from making even a temporary use of this little sum of government money. John Calhoun, the surveyor of Sangamon County, was at this time overburdened with work. The principal local industry was speculation in land. Every settler, of course, wanted his farm surveyed and marked out for him, and every community had its syndicate of leading citizens who cherished a scheme of laying out a city somewhere. In many cases the city was plotted, the sites of the principal buildings, including a courthouse and a university, were determined, and a sonorous name was selected out of Plutarch before its location was even considered. For this latter office the intervention of an official surveyor was necessary, and therefore Mr. Calhoun had more business than he could attend to without assistance. Looking about for a young man of good character, intelligent enough to learn surveying at short notice, his attention was soon attracted to Lincoln. He offered young Abraham a book containing the elements of the art, and told him when he had mastered it he should have employment. The offer was a flattering one, and Lincoln, with that steady self-reliance of his, accepted it, and armed with his book went out to the schoolmasters, Menton Graham's, and in 6 weeks' close application made himself a surveyor. Footnote: There has been some discussion as to whether Lincoln served as deputy under Calhoun or Neal. The truth is that he served under both of them. Calhoun was surveyor in 1833, when Lincoln first learned the business. Neal was elected in 1835, and immediately appointed Lincoln and Calhoun as his deputies. The Sangamo Journal of September 12, 1835, contains the following official advertisement: Surveyor's Notice. I have appointed John B. Watson, Abram Lincoln, and John Calhoun deputy surveyors for Sangamon County. In my absence from town, any persons wishing their land surveyed will do well to call at the recorder's office and enter his or their names in a book left for that purpose, stating township and range in which they respectively live, and their business shall be promptly attended to. T. M. Neal. An article by Colonel G. A. Pierce, printed April 21, 1881, in the Chicago Inter-Ocean, describes an interview held in that month with W. G. Greene of Menard County, in which this matter is referred to. But Mr. Greene relies more on the document in his possession than on his recollection of what took place in 1833. "Where did Lincoln learn his surveying?" I asked. "Took it up himself," replied Mr. Greene, "as he did 100 things, and mastered it too. When he acted as surveyor here he was deputy of T. M. Neal, and not of Calhoun, as has often been said." There was a dispute about this, and many sketches of his life gave Calhoun, Candlebox Calhoun as he was afterwards known during the Kansas troubles and election frauds, as the surveyor, but it was Neal. Mr. Greene turned to his desk and threw out an old certificate, in the handwriting of Lincoln, giving the boundaries of certain lands, and signed T. M. Neal, surveyor, by A. Lincoln, deputy, thus settling the question. Mr. Greene was a Democrat, and has leaned towards that party all his life, but what he thought and thinks of Lincoln can be seen by an endorsement on the back of the certificate named, which is as follows: "Preserve this, as it is the noblest of God's creation, A. Lincoln, the second preserver of his country, May 3, 1865. Penned by W. G. Greene, who taught Lincoln the English grammar in 1831. It will be remembered that Washington in his youth adopted the same profession. But there were few points of similarity in the lives of the two great presidents in youth or later manhood. The Virginian had every social advantage in his favor, and was by nature a man of more thrift and greater sagacity in money matters. He used the knowledge gained in the practice of his profession so wisely that he became rather early in life a large landholder, and continually increased his possessions until his death. Lincoln, with almost unbounded opportunities for the selection and purchase of valuable tracts, made no use whatever of them. He employed his skill and knowledge merely as a breadwinner, and made so little provision for the future that when Mr. Van Bergen, who had purchased the Radford note, sued and got judgment on it, his horse and his surveying instruments were taken to pay the debt, and only by the generous intervention of a friend was he able to redeem these invaluable means of his living. He was, nevertheless, an excellent surveyor. His portion of the public work executed under the directions of Mr. Calhoun and his successor, T. M. Neal, was well performed, and he soon found his time pretty well employed with private business which came to him from Sangamon and the adjoining counties. Early in the year 1834 we find him appointed one of 3 "viewers" to locate a road from Salt Creek to the county line in the direction of Jacksonville. The board seems to have consisted mainly of its chairman, as Lincoln made the deposit of money required by law, surveyed the route, plotted the road, and wrote the report. Footnote: as this is probably the earliest public document extant written and signed by Lincoln, we give it in full. March 3, 1834. Reuben Harrison presented the following petition: "We, the undersigned, respectfully request your honorable body to appoint viewers to view and locate a road from Music's Ferry on Salt Creek, via New Salem, to the county line in the direction of Jacksonville." And Abram Lincoln deposited with the clerk $10, as the law directs. Ordered that Michael Killen, Hugh Armstrong, and Abram Lincoln be appointed to view said road, and said Lincoln to act as surveyor. To the County Commissioner's Court for the County of Sangamon at its June term, 1834. We, the undersigned, being appointed to view and locate a whole length of road, 26 road, beginning at Music's Ferry on Salt Creek, via New Salem, to the county line in the direction of Jacksonville, respectfully report that we have performed the duties of said view and location as required by law, and that we have made the location on good ground, and believe the establishment of the same to be necessary and proper. The enclosed map gives the courses and distances as required by law. Michael Killen, Hugh Armstrong, A. Lincoln. Endorsement in pencil, also in Lincoln's handwriting. A. Lincoln, 5 days at $3, $15. John A. Kelso, chain bearer, for 5 days at 75 cents, $3.75. Robert Lloyd at 75 cents, $3.75. Hugh Armstrong, for services as axeman, 5 days at 75 cents, $3.75. A. Lincoln, for making plot and report, $2.50. On map, whole length of road, 26 miles and 70 chains, scale 2 inches to the mile. End footnote. Though it is evident that the post office and the surveyor's compass were not making a rich man of him, they were sufficient to enable him to live decently, and during the year he greatly increased his acquaintance and his influence in the county. The one followed the other naturally. Every acquaintance he made became his friend, and even before the end of his unsuccessful canvass in 1832 it had become evident to the observant politicians of the district that he was a man whom it would not do to leave out of their calculations. There seemed to be no limit to his popularity, nor to his aptitudes, in the opinion of his admirers. He was continually called on to serve in the most incongruous capacities. Old residents say he was the best judge at a horse race the county afforded. He was occasionally second in a duel of fisticuffs, though he usually contrived to reconcile the adversaries on the turf before any damage was done. He was the arbiter on all controverted points of literature, science, or woodcraft among the disputatious denizens of Clary's Grove, and his decisions were never appealed from. His native tact and humor were invaluable in his work as a peacemaker, and his enormous physical strength, which he always used with a magnanimity rare among giants, placed his offhand decrees beyond the reach of contemptuous question. He composed differences among friends and equals with good-natured raillery, but he was as rough as need be when his wrath was roused by meanness and cruelty. We hardly know whether to credit some of the stories, apparently well attested by living witnesses, of his prodigious muscular powers. He is said to have lifted, at Rutledge's mill, a box of stones weighing over half a ton. It is also related that he could raise a barrel of whiskey from the ground and drink from the bung, but the narrator adds that he never swallowed the whiskey. Whether these traditions are strictly true or not, they are evidently founded on the current reputation he enjoyed among his fellows for extraordinary strength, and this was an important element in his influence. He was known to be capable of handling almost any man he met, yet he never sought a quarrel. He was everybody's friend, and yet used no liquor or tobacco. He was poor, and had scarcely ever been at school, yet he was the best informed young man in the village. He had grown up on the frontier, the utmost fringe of civilization, yet he was gentle and clean of speech, innocent of blasphemy or scandal. His good qualities might have excited resentment if displayed by a well-dressed stranger from an Eastern state, but the most uncouth ruffians of New Salem took a sort of proprietary interest and pride in the decency and the cleverness and the learning of their friend and comrade, Abe Lincoln. It was regarded, therefore, almost as a matter of course that Lincoln should be a candidate for the legislature at the next election, which took place in August, 1834. He was sure of the united support of the Whigs, and so many of the Democrats also wanted to vote for him that some of the leading members of that party came to him and proposed they should give him an organized support. He was too loyal a partisan to accept their overtures without taking counsel from the Whig candidates. He laid the matter before Major Stuart, who at once advised him to make the canvass. It was a generous and chivalrous action, for by thus encouraging the candidacy of Lincoln he was endangering his own election. But his success 2 years before, in the face of a vindictive opposition led by the strongest Jackson men in the district, had made him somewhat confident, and he perhaps thought he was risking little by giving a helping hand to his comrade in the spy battalion. Before the election Lincoln's popularity developed itself in rather a portentous manner, and it required some exertion to save the seat of his generous friend. At the close of the poll, the 4 successful candidates held the following relative positions: Lincoln, 1,376; Dawson, 1,370; Carpenter, 1,170; and Stuart, at that time probably the most prominent young man in the district, and the one marked out by the public voice for an early election to Congress, 1,164. End of Section 6. Recording by Stephen L. Moss. StephenLMoss.com.
Section 7 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 1, by John G. Nicolay and John Hay. Section 7, Legislative Experience. The election of Mr. Lincoln to the legislature may be said to have closed the pioneer portion of his life. He was done with the wild carelessness of the woods, with the jolly ruffianism of Clary's Grove, with the petty chaffering of grocery stores, with odd jobs for daily bread, with all the uncouth squalor of the frontier poverty. It was not that his pecuniary circumstances were materially improved. He was still, and for years continued to be, a very poor man, harassed by debts which he was always working to pay, and sometimes in distress for the means of decent subsistence. But from this time forward his associations were with a better class of men than he had ever known before, and a new feeling of self-respect must naturally have grown up in his mind from his constant intercourse with them, a feeling which extended to the minor morals of civilized life. A sophisticated reader may smile at the mention of anything like social ethics in Vandalia in 1834, but, compared with Gentryville and New Salem, the society which assembled in the winter at that little capital was polished and elegant. The state then contained nearly 250,000 inhabitants, and the members of the legislature, elected purely on personal grounds, nominated by themselves or their neighbors without the intervention of party machinery, were necessarily the leading men, in one way or another, in their several districts. Among the colleagues of Lincoln at Vandalia were young men with destinies only less brilliant than his own. They were to become governors, senators, and judges. They were to organize the Whig Party of Illinois, and afterward the Republican. They were to lead brigades and divisions in 2 great wars. Among the first persons he met there, not in the legislature proper, but in the lobby, where he was trying to appropriate an office then filled by Colonel John J. Hardin, was his future antagonist, Stephen A. Douglas. Neither seemed to have any presentiment of the future greatness of the other. Douglas thought little of the raw youth from the Sangamon timber, and Lincoln said the dwarfish Vermonter was "the least man" he had ever seen. To all appearances Vandalia was full of better men than either of them, clever lawyers, men of wit and standing, some of them sons of provident early settlers, but more who had come from older states to seek their fortunes in these fresh fields. During his first session Lincoln occupied no especially conspicuous position. He held his own respectably among the best. One of his colleagues tells us he was not distinguished by any external eccentricity, that he wore, according to the custom of the time, a decent suit of blue jeans, that he was known simply as a rather quiet young man, good-natured and sensible. Before the session ended he had made the acquaintance of most of the members, and had evidently come to be looked upon as possessing more than ordinary capacity. His unusual common sense began to be recognized. His name does not often appear in the records of the year. He introduced a resolution in favor of securing to the state a part of the proceeds of the sales of public lands within its limits. He took part in the organization of the ephemeral Whig Party, which was designed to unite all the anti-Jackson elements under the leadership of Hugh L. White of Tennessee. He voted with the minority in favor of Young against Robinson for senator, and with the majority that passed the bank and canal bills, which were received with great enthusiasm throughout Illinois, and which were only the precursors of those gigantic and ill-advised schemes that came to maturity 2 years later and inflicted incalculable injury upon the state. Lincoln returned to New Salem after this winter's experience of men and things at the little capital, much firmer on his feet than ever before. He had had the opportunity of measuring himself with the leading men of the community, and had found no difficulty whatever in keeping pace with them. He continued his studies of the law and surveying together, and became quite indispensable in the latter capacity, so much so that General Neal, announcing in September, 1835, the names of the deputy surveyors of Sangamon County, placed the name of Lincoln before that of his old master in the science, John Calhoun. He returned to the legislature in the winter of 1835-6, and one of the first important incidents of the session was the election of a senator to fill the vacancy occasioned by the death of Elias Kent Kane. There was no lack of candidates. A journal of the time says, "This intelligence reached Vandalia on the evening of the 26th of December, and in the morning 9 candidates appeared in that place, and it was anticipated that a number more would soon be in, among them the Lion of the North, who, it is thought, will claim the office by preemption." It is not known who was the roaring celebrity here referred to, but the successful candidate was General William L. D. Ewing, who was elected by a majority of 1 vote. Lincoln and the other Whigs voted for him, not because he was a "white" man, as they frankly stated, but because he had been proscribed by the Van Buren party. Mr. Semple, the candidate for the regular Democratic caucus, was beaten simply on account of his political orthodoxy. A minority is always strongly in favor of independent action and bitterly opposed to caucuses, and therefore we need not be surprised at finding Mr. Lincoln, a few days later in the session, joining in hearty denunciation of the convention system which had already become popular in the East, and which General Jackson was then urging upon his faithful followers. The missionaries of this new system in Illinois were Stephen A. Douglas, recently from Vermont, the shifty young lawyer from Morgan County, who had just succeeded in having himself made circuit attorney in place of Colonel Hardin, and a man who was then regarded in Vandalia as a far more important and dangerous person than Douglas, Ebenezer Peck of Chicago. Peck was looked upon with distrust and suspicion for several reasons, all of which seemed valid to the rural legislators assembled here. He came from Canada, where he had been a member of the provincial parliament. It was therefore imagined that he was permeated with secret hostility to republican institutions. His garb, his furs, were of the fashion of Quebec, and he passed his time indoctrinated the Jackson men with the theory and practice of party organization, teachings which they eagerly absorbed, and which seemed sinister and ominous to the Whigs. He was showing them, in fact, the way in which elections were to be won. And though the Whigs denounced his system as subversive of individual freedoms and private judgment, it was not long before they were also forced to adopt it or be left alone with their virtue. The organization of political parties in Illinois really takes its rise from this time, and in great measure from the work of Mr. Peck with the Vandalia legislature. There was no man more dreaded and disliked than he was by the stalwart young Whigs against whom he was organizing that solid and disciplined opposition. But a quarter of a century brings wonderful changes. 25 years later, Mr. Peck stood shoulder to shoulder with these very men who then reviled him as a Canadian emissary of tyranny and corruption, with S.T. Logan, O.H. Browning, and J.K. Dubois, organizing a new party for victory under the name of Abraham Lincoln. The legislature adjourned on the 18th of January, having made a beginning, it is true, in the work of improving the state by statute, though its modest work, incorporating canal and bridge companies and providing for public roads, bore no relation to the ambitious essays of its successor. Among the bills passed at this session was an apportionment act, by which Sangamon County became entitled to 7 representatives and 2 senators, and early in the spring 8 white statesmen of the county were ready for the field, the 9th, Mr. Herndon, holding over as state senator. It seems singular to us of a later day that just 8 prominent men on a side should have offered themselves for these places without the intervention of any primary meetings. Such a thing, if we mistake not, was never known again in Illinois. The convention system was afterwards seen to be an absolute necessity to prevent the disorganization of parties through the restless vanity of obscure and insubordinate aspirants. But the 8 who took the stump in Sangamon in summer of 1836 were supported as loyally and as energetically as if they had been nominated with all the solemnity of modern days. They became famous in the history of the state, partly for their stature and partly for their influence in legislation. They were called, with Herndon, the Long Nine. Their average height was over 6 feet, and their aggregate altitude was said to be 55 feet. Their names were Abraham Lincoln, John Dawson, Dan Stone, Ninian W. Edwards, William F. Elkin, R. L. Wilson, and Andrew McCormick, candidates for the House of Representatives, and Job Fletcher for the Senate of Illinois. Mr. Lincoln began his canvass with the following circular: New Salem, June 13, 1836. To the editor of the Journal. In your paper of last Saturday I see a communication over the signature "Many Voters," in which the candidates who were announced in the Journal are called upon to show their hands. Agreed. Here is mine. I go for all sharing the privileges of the government who assist in bearing its burdens. Consequently, I go for admitting all whites to the right of suffrage who pay taxes or bear arms, by no means excluding females. If elected, I shall consider the whole people of Sangamon my constituents, as well those that oppose as those that support me. While acting as their representative, I shall be governed by their will on all subjects upon which I have the means of knowing what their will is, and upon all others I shall do what my own judgment teaches me will best advance their interests. Whether elected or not, I go for distributing the proceeds of the sales of the public lands to the several States, to enable our State, in common with others, to dig canals and construct railroads, without borrowing money and paying interest on it. If alive on the first Monday in November, I shall vote for Hugh L. White for President. Footnote: This phrase seems to have been adopted as a formula by the anti-Jackson party. The cards of several candidates contain it. End footnote. Very respectfully, A. Lincoln. It would be hard to imagine a more audacious and unqualified declaration of principles and intentions, but it was the fashion of the hour to promise exact obedience to the will of the people, and the 2 practical questions touched by this circular were the only ones then much to talk about. The question of suffrage for aliens was a living problem in the State, and Mr. Lincoln naturally took liberal ground on it. He was also in favor of getting from the sale of public lands a portion of the money he was ready to vote for internal improvements. This was good Whig doctrine at the time, and the young politician did not fancy he could go wrong in following in such a matter the lead of his idol Henry Clay. He made an active canvass, and spoke frequently during the summer. He must have made some part of the campaign on foot, for we find in the county paper an advertisement of a horse which had strayed or been stolen from him while on a visit to Springfield. It was not an imposing animal, to judge from the description. It was plainly marked with harness, and was believed to have lost some of his shoes. But it was a large horse, as suited a cavalier of such stature, and trotted and paced in a serviceable manner. In July a rather remarkable discussion took place at the county seat, in which many of the leading men on both sides took part. Ninian Edwards, son of the late governor, is said to have opened the debate with much effect. Mr. Early, who followed him, was so roused by his energetic attack that he felt his only resource was a flat contradiction, which in those days meant mischief. In the midst of great and increasing excitement, Dan Stone and John Calhoun made speeches which did not tend to pour oil on the waters of contention, and then came Mr. Lincoln's turn. As an article in the Journal states, that he seemed embarrassed in his opening, for this was the most important contest in which he had ever been engaged. But he soon felt the easy mastery of his powers come back to him, and he finally made what was universally regarded as the strongest speech of the day. One of his colleagues says that on this occasion he used in his excitement for the first time that singularly effective clear tenor tone of voice which afterwards became so widely known in the political battles of the West. The canvass was an energetic one throughout, and excited more interest in the district than even the presidential election which occurred some months later. Mr. Lincoln was elected at the head of the poll by a majority greatly in excess of the average majority of his friends, which shows conclusively how his influence and popularity had increased. The Whigs in this election effected a revolution in the politics of the county. By force of their ability and standing they had before managed to divide the suffrages of the people, even while they were unquestionably in the minority. But this year they completely defeated their opponents and gained that control of the county which they never lost as long as the party endured. If Mr. Lincoln had no other claims to be remembered than his services in the legislature of 1836-7, there would be little to say in his favor. Its history is one of disaster to the state. Its legislation was almost wholly unwise and hurtful. The most we can say for Mr. Lincoln is that he obeyed the will of his constituents as he promised to do, and labored with singular skill and ability to accomplish the objects desired by the people who gave him their votes. The especial work entrusted to him was the subdivision of the county and the project for the removal of the capital of the state to Springfield. Footnote: Lincoln was at the head of the project to remove the seat of government to Springfield. It was entirely entrusted to him to manage. The members were all elected on one ticket, but they all looked to Lincoln as the head. Stephen T. Logan. End footnote. In both of these he was successful. In the account of errors and follies committed by the legislature to the lasting injury of the state, he is entitled to no praise or blame beyond the rest. He shared in that sanguine epidemic of financial and industrial quackery which devastated the entire community, and voted with the best men of the country in favor of schemes which appeared then like a promise of an immediate millennium and seem now like a midsummer madness. He entered political life in one of those eras of delusive prosperity which so often precede great financial convulsions. The population of the state was increasing at an enormous rate of 200% in 10 years. It had extended northward along the lines of the wooded valleys of creeks and rivers in the center to Peoria, on the west by the banks of the Mississippi to Galena, on the east with wide intervals of wilderness to Chicago. The edge of the timber was everywhere pretty well occupied, though the immigrants from the forest states of Kentucky and Tennessee had as yet avoided the prairies. The rich soil and equable climate were now attracting an excellent class of settlers from the older states, and the long-neglected northern counties were receiving the attention they deserved. The War of Black Hawk had brought the country into notice. The utter defeat of his nation had given the guarantee of a permanent peace. The last lodges of the Pottawatomies had disappeared from the country in 1833. The money spent by the general government during the war, and paid to the volunteers at its close, added to the common prosperity. There was a brisk trade in real estate, and there was even a beginning in Chicago of that passion for speculation in town lots which afterwards became a frenzy. It was too much to expect of the Illinois legislature that it should understand that the best thing it could do to forward this prosperous tendency of things was to do nothing. For this is a lesson which has not yet been learned by any legislature in the world. For several years they had been tinkering, at first modestly and tentatively, at a scheme of internal improvements which should not cost too much money. In 1835 they began to grant charters for railroads, which remained in embryo, as the stock was never taken. Surveys for other railroads were also proposed to cross the state in different directions, and the project of uniting Lake Michigan with Illinois River by a canal was of too evident utility to be overlooked. In fact, the route had been surveyed and estimates of cost made, companies incorporated, and all preliminaries completed many years before, though nothing further had been done, as no funds had been offered from any source. But at the special session of 1835, a law was passed authorizing a loan of $500,000 for this purpose. The loan was effected by Governor Duncan the following year, and in June, a board of canal commissioners having been appointed, a beginning was actually made with pick and shovel. A restless feeling of hazardous speculation seemed to be taking possession of the State. It commenced, said Governor Ford, in his admirable chronicle, at Chicago, and was the means of building up that place in a year or two from a village of a few houses to be a city of several thousand inhabitants. The story of the sudden fortunes made there excited at first wonder and amazement, next a gambling spirit of adventure, and lastly an all-absorbing desire for sudden and splendid wealth. Chicago had been for some time only one great town market. The plots of towns for 100 miles around were carried there to be disposed of at auction. The Eastern people had caught the mania. Every vessel coming west was loaded with them, their money and means bound for Chicago, the great fairyland of fortunes. But as enough did not come to satisfy the insatiable greediness of the Chicago sharpers and speculators, they frequently consigned their wares to Eastern markets. In fact, land and town lots were the staple of the country, and were the only article of export. The contagion spread so rapidly, towns and cities were laid out so profusely, that it was a standing joke that before long there would be no land left in the State for farming purposes. The future of the State for many years to come was thus discounted by the fervid imaginations of its inhabitants. We have every requisite of great empire, they said, except enterprise and inhabitants. And they thought that a little enterprise would bring the inhabitants. Through the spring and summer of 1836 the talk of internal improvements grew more general and more clamorous. The candidates for office spoke about little else, and the only point of emulation among the parties was which should be more reckless and grandiose in its promises. When the time arrived for the assembling of the legislature, the members were not left to their own zeal and the recollection of their campaign pledges, but meetings and conventions were everywhere held to spur them up to the fulfillment of their mandate. The resolutions passed by the principal body of delegates who came together in December directed the legislature to vote a system of internal improvements commensurate with the wants of the people, a phrase which is never lacking in the mouth of a charlatan or demagogue. These demands were pressed upon a not reluctant legislature. They addressed themselves at once to the work required of them, and soon devised, with reckless and unreasoning haste, a scheme of railroads covering the vast uninhabited prairies as with a gridiron. There was to be a railroad from Galena to the mouth of the Ohio River, from Alton to Shawneetown, from Alton to Mount Carmel, from Alton to the eastern state boundary, by virtue of which lines Alton was to take the life of St. Louis without further notice, from Quincy to the Wabash River, from Bloomington to Pekin, from Peoria to Warsaw, in all 1,350 miles of railway. Some of these terminal cities were not in existence except upon neatly designed surveyors' maps. The scheme provided also for the improvement of every stream in the State on which a child's shingle boat could sail, and to the end that all objections should be stifled on the part of those neighborhoods which had neither railroads nor rivers, a gift of $200,000 was voted to them, and with this sop they were fain to be content and not trouble the general joy. To accomplish this stupendous scheme, the legislature voted $8 millions to be raised by loan. $4 millions were also voted to complete the canal. These sums, monstrous as they were still ridiculously inadequate to the purpose in view. But while the frenzy lasted there was no consideration of cost or of possibilities. These vast works were voted without estimates, without surveys, without any rational consideration of their necessity. The voice of reason seemed to be silent in the assembly. Only the utterances of fervid prophecy found listeners. Governor Ford speaks of one orator who insisted amid enthusiastic plaudits that the State could well afford to borrow $100 millions for internal improvements. The process of reasoning, or rather predicting, was easy and natural. The roads would raise the price of land, the State could enter large tracts and sell them at profit, foreign capital would be invested in the land and could be heavily taxed, to pay bonded interest, and the roads, as fast as they were built, could be operated at a great profit to pay for their own construction. The climax of the whole folly was reached by the provision of law directing that work should begin at once at the termini of all the roads and the crossings of all rivers. It is futile and disingenuous to attempt, as some have done, to fasten upon one or the other of the political parties of the State the responsibility of this bedlam legislation. The governor and a majority of the legislature were elected as Jackson Democrats, but the Whigs were as earnest in passing these measures as their opponents, and after they were adopted, the superior wealth, education, and business capacity of the Whigs had their legitimate influence, and they filled the principal positions upon the boards and commissions which came into existence under the acts. The bills were passed, not without opposition, it is true, but by sufficient majorities, and the news was received by the people of the State with the most extravagant demonstrations of delight. The villages were illuminated, bells were rung in the rare steeples of the churches, fireballs, bundles of candle wicks soaked in turpentine, were thrown by night all over the country. The day of payment was far away, and those who trusted the assurances of the sanguine politicians thought that in some mysterious way the scheme would pay for itself. Mr. Lincoln is continually found voting with his friends in favor of this legislation, and there is nothing to show that he saw any danger in it. He was a Whig, and as such in favor of internal improvements in general, and a liberal construction of constitutional law in such matters. As a boy he had interested himself in the details of local improvements of rivers and roads, and he doubtless went with the current in Vandalia in favor of this enormous system. He took, however, no prominent part in the work by which these railroad bills were passed. He considered himself as specially commissioned to procure the removal of the State capital from Vandalia to Springfield, and he applied all his energies to the accomplishment of this work. The enterprise was hedged round with difficulties, for although it was everywhere agreed, except at Vandalia, that the capital ought to be moved, every city in the State, and several which existed only on paper, demanded to be made the seat of government. The question had been submitted to a popular vote in 1834, and the result showed about as many cities desirous of opening their gates to the legislature as claimed the honor of being the birthplace of Homer. Of these, Springfield was only third in popular estimation, and it was evident that Mr. Lincoln had need of all his wits if he were to fulfill the trust confided to him. It is said by Governor Ford that the Long Nine were not averse to using the hopes and fears of other members in relation to their special railroads to gain their adherence to the Springfield program, but this is by no means clear. We are rather inclined to trust the direct testimony of Jesse K. Dubois that the success of the Sangamon County delegation in obtaining the capital was due to the adroit management of Mr. Lincoln, first in inducing all the rival claimants to unite in a vote to move the capital from Vandalia, and then in carrying a direct vote for Springfield through the joint convention by the assistance of the southern counties. His personal authority accomplished this in great part. Mr. Dubois says, "He made Webb and me vote for the removal, though we belonged to the southern end of the State. We defended our vote before our constituents by saying that necessity would ultimately force the seat of government to a central position. But in reality we gave the vote to Lincoln because we liked him, because we wanted to oblige our friend, and because we recognized him as our leader." To do this they were obliged to quarrel with their most intimate associates, who had bought a piece of waste land at the exact geographical center of the State, and were striving to have the capital established there in the interest of their own pockets and territorial symmetry. The bill was passed only a short time before the legislature adjourned, and the Long Nine came back to their constituents wearing their well-won laurels. They were complimented in the newspapers, at public meetings, and even at subscription dinners. We read of one at Springfield, at the Rural Hotel, to which 60 guests sat down, where there were speeches by Browning, Lincoln, Douglas, who had resigned his seat in the legislature to become the Register of the Land Office at the new capital, S.T. Logan, Baker, and others, whose wit and wisdom were lost to history through the absence of reporters. Another dinner was given them at Athens a few weeks later. Among the toasts on these occasions were two which we may transcribe: "Abraham Lincoln, he has fulfilled the expectations of his friends and disappointed the hopes of his enemies," and "A. Lincoln, one of nature's noblemen." End of section 7. Recording by Jesse Crisp Sears in Pittsboro, North Carolina.